Good morning. So we're continuing our character series, which is a very short series. We did Ruth and Boaz last week, and Anthony spoke, and he sort of drew out lessons that we can learn about relationships. And this morning, I'm continuing with looking at the character of King David. And King David is a man that's referred to as a man after God's own heart. And when we were considering this character series, I knew that I wanted to speak about David. And the reason I knew that is because I've been listening to this sermon series, and it gave us all these different events in David's life. And I found there are so many lessons that we can take when we look at his life and see what's happened. And in fact, in the Bible, David is one of the most talked about characters in the Bible. There are 66 chapters dedicated to the life of David. That's in 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel. He ends up dying at the beginning of Kings, and he's in Chronicles as well. So there's a lot of chapters that are all about the life of David. Don't worry, I'm not going to read all 66 chapters this morning. That's not going to be in Bible reading. Well, let's begin. Let's go. We'll go through. Here we go. 1 Samuel. No, but I'm hopefully we're going to go through just a little bit of some of the key moments in his life, a little bit of color in between. We'll learn about David, but we're also going to learn that actually he has a lot of interesting moments in his life. He has these great successes, and then he has these massive, major failures, moral failures in his life. But always in these situations, we see in his successes, it's his heart for God. And then also in his failures, he turns back to God. So we're going to look at a few things. The stories that we're going to go through, if that's eventually going to work, the stories that we're going to go through are actually looking at why God chose David in the first place, and looking at his anointing. We're then going to go through the situations in which David does the right thing. And we've got the stories, one of David versus Goliath. And then, great, I've got it. David versus, sneak peek. David versus Goliath. And then David sparing Saul's life when he could have killed him earlier, who was the king before him. And then we're going to be looking at some of the failures. We're actually going to skip, I think, David in the census, but so actually I've already taken it off the slides, which is great. But looking at David and Bathsheba, which is probably the most famous failure of David's life, and we're going to look at how that we can learn from that. But first of all, a little bit into the narrative of David. So this is King David. You might know this famous statue of him. It's been censored for church, but so that's David. Also, most of what we learn about David, it comes from Samuel. Now, Samuel, as the books 1 and 2 Samuel are in reference to the prophet Samuel. Now, he doesn't actually make it all the way through Samuel 2. He doesn't live through his own book, but he is one of the most important characters for us to know about. He was leading the people of Israel. He's referred to as the last judge of the judges of Israel that happened before we see this series of kings. And then you've got King Saul, who is the first king of Israel. And he's not considered a great king. And in fact, God rejects him for repeated failures in his attitude towards God. So it's a no to Saul. And that's where we kick things off in 1 Samuel 16. So Samuel gets told, right, stop grieving over Saul. I'm gonna give you a new king that you can find and anoint. And he is in Bethlehem, which is very close to Jerusalem. And so Samuel goes to Bethlehem, and he's guided to the house of a man called Jesse. And he meets all of Jesse's sons. Right? He meets his sons, and he thinks, this is clearly the right one. And then God says no. And he goes through all of the sons, and they all look like they're the right person to be the next king. But God says, no, it's none of these. And so then it turns out that there's another son who's in the fields looking after the sheep. And so Samuel then meets this last son who is called David. And when Samuel meets David, God says to him this really interesting phrase: man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. And it's what's in our heart this morning that we're going to be looking at. And the message of David that I'm going to be filling out this morning is, how can we have a heart for God? And so what happens is Samuel whips out his anointing oil and he anoints David, and hey presto, this is going to be the next king. But let's have a look at why yes to David, but why no to Paul. To Saul, sorry, wrong one. No to Saul. Well, first of all, why do they want a king? Well, the priests have been leading. They've been interpreting what God has been saying to the people, and Samuel's sons are meant to be the ones who are taking over. In fact, he set them up already as leaders over Israel. But there's a problem. His sons, Samuel's sons, do not follow in Samuel's ways. They are dishonest. They've been accepting bribes, and they've been perverting justice. And so, for good reason, the people are saying, look, we don't want these priests in charge of us. And then the second thing is, well, they want to win wars. They want a strong leader that they can follow. They want someone that they can follow into battle. And if we look at the situation that's surrounding the Israelites, it makes a little bit of sense. Israel is this sort of green kingdom that you can see in the middle. They've got enemies all around them that frequently attack them. You've got the Philistines, who are particularly belligerent, and they're attacking them. They're these people that have come from the sea, and they're constantly invading, as you will see throughout the stories. So it's obvious why they might want a king. But the really sad thing is here, the really tragic thing is that this people are a people that have been taken out of slavery, that they have time and time again seen God blessing them, seen God pulling them out of desperate situations. And yet, because of the circumstances around them, they don't want to, and they're not willing to just trust God. And as we're going through some of these stories this morning, it might be worth reflecting and thinking, are you someone that is going to trust God with your life? Or are you going to be someone that, like the Israelites, is looking at their circumstances and then changing their attitude to God based on what's happening around them? Or are you someone that's going to take your peace and your joy from God? But we'll look at a little bit of why they might want Saul specifically, why he might be a good king. Well, first of all, the text says he's handsome, right? He is a good-looking man. And then secondly, he is tall. It tells us he's a head and shoulder taller than everyone else around him. So if you're looking for a charismatic leader that's going to take you into battle, Saul seems like he's going to be the right guy. He looks the part. But why did God say David is the one that he wants to be king? Well, it's this verse, man looks at the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. Through the rest of the successes and failures, I want you to keep this in mind about David. He always has a heart for God. Now, when I was 23, I got put in charge of a project. It was a really big opportunity for me, my first project that I was leading on my own. And within the first 2 weeks, team came to me and they said, hey, there's this guy in the team. He's the most senior person technically. He's the most skilled person, but he is an absolute nightmare to work with. We want you to take him off the team. And one of the leaders that was there that came to me, he said, look, actually, this guy's also on probation. So if you kick him off the project, he's going to lose his job. And I'm 23. I'm thinking this guy's got a family. He's got children. But I'm also hearing he's really awful to work with. And so I was faced with this situation. Do I kick him off the team and know what's going to happen, what the consequences of that are going to be? Or do I try and keep him and everyone else has to suffer with him being there? And in the end, I did decide it was the right thing to do, to say, look, I can't have him on this project. And the crazy thing is, after doing that, after taking off the most senior member of the team in terms of technical ability, we actually got more done in the next 2 weeks than we had in the 2 weeks that he'd been there. And throughout my time as a manager, I've found that I've had to hire people, I've had to let people go, and I've never regretted giving an opportunity to someone that had the right attitude. They might not have all of the skills that we need them to have, but they're prepared to work in the role. And then secondly, I've never regretted losing someone that had the wrong attitude, that was difficult, that was a pain to work with. Now, that's a very different situation to sort of having a heart for God, but I'm hoping that you can think about people in your life that have had just an awful attitude to situations, or people that have had an amazing attitude in really tough situations. The people that pray through difficulties and you see them weather storms that you're shocked they can get through. And that's what we're exploring today: is what is your attitude towards God despite what's happening in the world? What is your heart's attitude for God this morning? I'm going to see in David's life how we can have a heart for God. So we're going to continue with this narrative and looking at what happens between David in the early years of his life. So Saul, he's been rejected by God, and actually he ends up being tormented by this harmful spirit. And he ends up speaking to his servants, saying, hey, does anyone know anyone that can play the lyre, that can play some music for me to soothe me when I'm being tormented by these spirits? And actually one of his servants turns around and says, yeah, I know a guy. He lives in Bethlehem, really close by. And it turns out that it's David. And so David comes and he ends up playing the lyre in Saul's court. And then it's about this time we also see the Philistines come and attack again. And they're at this place, which is called the Valley of Elah. And the Philistines are on the mountains on one side. The Israelites are on the mountains on the other side. Hopefully you can see the Israelites are sort of camped at the top there. The Philistines are here. And you've got this giant that comes down, and he is challenging the people of Israel. He's challenging the army. And for about 40 days, he comes out in the front with his shield bearer, and he says, I'll fight any of you, right? He challenges, and he sort of says, one-on-one to decide what's going to happen here. And he's referred to as a giant. Now, he's either about 9'9" or 6'6", depending on what you think a cubit is. Supposedly it's from your elbow to the top of your fingers is a cubit. So this guy is giant. And at the time, the average height would have been about 5'5". So if he's 9'9", this guy is massive. So Saul and the rest of the Israelites are afraid, and no one wants to go out and fight him. And this is where we see David enter the situation. Now, we already know two of the jobs that David has had. The first one is he's been a shepherd out in the fields. The second job is he's gone and he's played this lyre for Saul. He's a Saul soother. But now we add to that bread delivery. He has also been sent by his dad to deliver bread to his three older brothers who are at this battle. And Jesse sends him, his father sends him, and he gets there and he hears Goliath challenging the men. And then, he sees him, he says this interesting phrase, he says it twice. He says, who is this uncircumcised Philistine? Right, which is one of my favorite phrases from the reading that I've done. And he says, hey, I'll kill this guy. And so he gets taken to Saul, and he has to persuade Saul that he's going to do it. And he says, look, I've killed lions and bears while protecting the sheep. This is going to be no different from that. And so they end up saying, okay, we're going to send this kid out to fight this giant because they're all scared to do it. This is the only person that's come forward in 40 days that's willing to fight this guy. And they try giving him the armor. They try giving him the king's armor and that he can wear it. And they say, actually, no, he can't wear it. He's never tested it. He's not used it before. He doesn't know how to use the armor. So instead, what he does is he takes his sling that he's killed lions and bears with, and he goes out to fight this giant. And everyone is kind of expecting it to not go very well. But what David does is he runs at him. He puts a stone from his bag. He swirls it around, and then boom, headshot. Hits him in one, and he goes down. And then he runs in, and we hear at the end of Goliath is this. David ran and stood over him. He took hold of the Philistine's sword and drew it from the sheath. After he killed him, he cut off his head with the sword. And when the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they turned and ran. And then all of the Philistines get chased back to their cities over here, which are Gath and Ekron, which are these walled cities that they then take and seek refuge in. And so the interesting thing that we see from here is this. Out of everyone else that was there, David was the one who had a heart for God. Saul, who's this king, this handsome, tall guy, who's meant to be fighting battles for Israel, that's why they wanted a king. But he shies away from his responsibility. He doesn't step forward to be a champion for his people. And if you think about it, David is too young to be in the army, right? His three oldest brothers are there because they're of age to be drawn into the army. David is the seventh one. He's the youngest of all of them. And then secondly, when he's preparing to fight for Goliath, one of his brothers is saying, look, you are still young. Goliath has been fighting since he was young. In other words, he has more years fighting than you do on the earth. And yet, David trusts God in this situation. Not in his own power. He knows the promises of God that he will protect his people. And so when he comes to meet Goliath, he says this. This is before he's killed him, obviously. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands. And I don't know what battles you might be facing. Hopefully not a 9-foot giant. But I do know that God keeps his promises. David draws strength from his relationship with God. That's what helps him face the challenges of his day. And actually, we can see this directly. If you go to if you go to Psalms, you'll see many, many times, not just in this situation, but there are many times David is facing difficulties. And in a moment, you're going to see how hard David's life becomes after this moment. He cries out and he questions God. He is real with his emotions. The amazing thing is, all of the Psalms, despite him being surrounded by enemies and having real problems and things to deal with, he ends them in a very similar way. And I've just picked out one, which is Psalm 32, verses 10 and 11, where he says this: "Many are the sorrows of the wicked, but steadfast love surrounds the one who trusts in the Lord. Be glad in the Lord, rejoice, O righteous, and shout for joy, all you upright in heart." And so, whatever the situation is your heart in the right place? Do you have a heart like David, that no matter the circumstances you're facing, you can say, I'm going to trust in the Lord? And I encourage you, if you're going through something, go to the Psalms as a book. See the troubles that David's talking about and lamenting, but see how his heart always comes back and turns to God. But there's more that we can learn. Sneak peek. There's more that we can learn from David. The first is or the second thing about this battle with Goliath is he's grown his skills. He's grown his skills. So it's at the critical moment that he needs that he can take action. He is ready for the fight. He knows how he can solve this issue, right? He's faced with a situation. Everyone else is saying, right, use this armor, use this sword. And he's saying, I don't know how to use these things, but I do know the skills that I have. So he's invested in these skills. He's using the talents God has given him to face the situation of the day. And this is the point where I was going to list a whole series of different talents and how you could use them, but I actually thought that might be limiting because I don't want you to be trapped into, well, these are the only ways that you can serve. Think about the talents that God's given you and ask, what are the things that God might want me to be investing in? David, he was in the field fighting off lions and bears, being forgotten in the fields and the shepherds for years. It might be that there's something that you need to develop and hone and grow for many years without seeing necessarily any fruit from it. But if God is saying, this is something I want you to invest in, there's a purpose behind it. Are you investing in the talents and the gifts that you have? And then secondly, are you seeing where you could be using them for God? Do you use what you have to bless others around you? The last thing I want to touch on just with the story with Goliath is this. We need to stand up for what is right. There will be a time in your life you need to be brave. Awful things happen all the time. It's because of Christian influence in the UK that things like education and healthcare have become accessible to many people. Perhaps most famously, There was the abolition of slavery happened in the UK because of the conviction of Christians who saw something that was wrong and stood against it. There are many issues facing the world today. There are also going to be situations in your own life that are much closer to home that might affect only a few people. And we're called in these places, both high and low, to be having a heart for God. And that means being willing to do what is right in each and every situation, often at risk to our own lives, that we may suffer loss because we're standing up for what is right. And the question is this, if your heart's truly in the right place, what are you going to do when a situation does arise? And so now we go on to the next part of the story, what everyone's been waiting for, this slide that snuck up earlier. So Jonathan, who is Saul's son, he at this time becomes best friends with David. So even Saul's own family start to really embrace David. David is so successful at this time in battles that Saul puts him in charge of his fighting men. And then this is where the problems all start to begin. Why would there be problems? He's friends with Saul's son. He's going out. He's getting all these victories. You guessed it. Women are the problem. It's actually Saul that's the problem, but he's triggered by the things that the women are saying. So the women, seeing these victories, start to sing, and they start singing about Saul's victories, and they start singing about David's victories, and they say, Saul has killed his thousands, but David has killed his 10,000s. And it's this comparison that Saul really doesn't like. And he starts to become jealous. And eventually he ends up in a situation where he throws his spear at David. In fact, he says, I'll pin him to the wall. He's so angry with him, he does it twice. He throws a spear at him again, and he misses. 0 for 2 at this point. And then there comes the situation, Saul promises his eldest daughter in marriage to David. And then he sort of reneges on that promise, and he doesn't give her in marriage. And then his younger daughter falls for David and seems to take a liking to him. And he goes, I know what I'll do. I'll use this as a trap to get him killed. So what does he do? He says, right, well, as a dowry for my daughter, I want you to give me 100 foreskins, right? Normal wedding present. And the idea is, he's going to go and make him fight and bring back evidence that he's killed 100. You might ask why foreskins. It's to prove that they were non-Jewish people that he's killed. But David's a romantic. David doesn't just bring back 100 foreskins. No. David brings back 200 foreskins. What a romantic man. You see, his plan was to kill David, but now he's giving his daughter to him in marriage. So I'll stop the distraction of the banana. But he's now fearful because, he set this trap up for David, and David's now been success, and people are seeing his strength and his prowess, and they like him because of it. And so Saul comes together and he tells his servants, right, I am going to kill David. But Jonathan is his best friend, and Jonathan says, hey, that's not cool. So Saul relents. He says, okay, I'm not gonna kill him. And then there's another war, and David's useful in wars, and so he doesn't kill him. But then again, trouble comes, and Saul is tormented by a spirit, and he gets angry again. And look at this! He throws a spear at David, but he misses again. He's 0 for 3 at this point. I haven't included it, but he also at one point throws a spear at Jonathan, and he misses again. So he's 0 for 4 in the book of Samuel. But this leads to this situation where it's no longer safe, so David ends up fleeing. And there's now a helpful map that hopefully you can see at least a little bit. But he flees up here. He flees from a place called Gibeah up to where Samuel is at Naoth in Ramah. Saul then seeks him there, and so he has to flee back to Jonathan. Saul ends up naked, but I don't have time to go through that story, but it's also hilarious. But David then flees to Ahimelech, who's the priest at a place called Nob. And then from this place called Nob, So from Nob, he then he collects this sword from Goliath. He goes to seek refuge in Gath. And Gath is over here. You might remember that. That is where the Philistines ran away. JS has lost it. I don't know quite why. So and at this time he goes to Gath, and they sort of recognize him. Isn't this David, who's the guy that killed Goliath? Because running to your enemies isn't necessarily the best idea. And so in order to get out of the situation, he ends up pretending he's crazy, and he foams at the mouth to convince them that he's not this guy that's killed Goliath. So he then flees to, and he gets set up in a place called the Cave of Adullam. And at this time, his army grows to about 400, and he goes and he takes his parents to keep them safe with the Moabites, with the Moabite king, because Saul is out to get him. Because of this, he then ends up going into a place which is called the wilderness in Ziph. It gets referred to as the stronghold, and Saul is out searching for him to kill him. He then ends up, therefore, going to the forest of Hereth. And then he hears, when he's in Hereth, he hears about this city that's being attacked called Keilah. Keilah is here. So he goes to go and defend it from the Philistines who are attacking again. And Saul, because he's the king, comes out and is responding to this threat as well. And so David, now his army's grown to 600, they now retreat. And he goes back and they hide in the wilderness in Ziph. Unfortunately, the men of Ziph betray him to Saul. And so he has to go and live in a place called Moab, which is just to the south. This is where he starts to meet Saul, and he refuses to kill him. So David narrowly escapes capture from Saul, and he flees to this stronghold of En-gedi. And this is where David, having evaded capture, refuses to take the life of Saul for the first time. He then escapes again to the wilderness in Paran, and having run away, is where another situation where David is again betrayed by the people of Ziph, and he spares Saul's life again, and he ends up fleeing eventually to King Achish, who is the king of Gath. So he does end up taking refuge with the Philistines. Now, it might not seem it because I've gone through it very quickly, but this is a period of about 10 to 15 years. So David has been on the run. He's had twice the opportunity to kill Saul, and he's had to put his trust in the Lord. And he's had two opportunities to kill him, but he said, no, this is God's anointed. I'm not going to be the one that kills him. It's not right for me to do. I'm going to trust in God's timing. And this is where we see this situation again. David is a man after God's own heart. To go into the stories of the cave a little bit more, in 1 Samuel 24, in the wilderness in En-gedi, Saul enters the cave that David is hiding in with his men. David doesn't kill him. Instead, he goes and he cuts off the corner of his cloak to prove that he could have killed him, and he confronts Saul about it. And then in the wilderness of Ziph, that I talked about later, 1 Samuel 26, David sees that he's being pursued by Saul, and they're encamped with his army in the wilderness. So David says to his men, right, who's going to come with me to the camp? And he goes in, and he from Saul sleeping next to him, in front of him, he takes his spear and he takes his water jug. And he ends up confronting Abner, who's the general. And he says, you're not doing your job. You're not defending the king because I was able to sneak into the camp. But he also confronts Saul, and Saul is shamed and has to retreat back to his palace. Again, we see these situations where David knows what the right thing is to do, and he has the integrity to do it. He proves that he could have killed Saul, but because God hasn't told him to do it, he's not willing to take Saul's life. Saul is an anointed king, and so therefore it's not right that he should take his life. And it's very striking. We often know the right thing to do. We simply don't have the integrity to do it. When we seek advice, we usually already know what the right answer is. We often go to friends and we know what we think the response is. And actually, who you go to probably tells you a lot about where you are in your heart. Because are you going to go to the person that's going to challenge you and tell you what you know you need to hear? Or are you going to go to the person that will it's okay, it's fine, tell you what you want to hear versus what you need to hear? Who do you go to for advice is actually showing you as much where your heart is and are you in the right place. Temptation is very real, and it often has very positive, immediate benefits. And so we're not just needing to do the right thing in taking action and going out into the world and standing up for what's right. There are also times we need patience. We need to be abstaining from things. We need to not necessarily seek the quick, easy solutions to problems. And there are many ways that this can come up. You could be dating the wrong person. You could be taking a job that's going to force you to do things that you know are immoral. You could be putting yourself in situations where you know it's going to lead you to do the wrong thing. But here's the other thing. Not every situation will end well. David, because he doesn't kill Saul, ends up having to run away. You can see how difficult his life is because he's choosing not to kill Saul. He ends up taking refuge with his enemies. And in fact, a really good example of this is Stephen. Is in Acts, he's the first person to die for the gospel. He dies standing up for what's right. God doesn't promise us circumstances. I don't want the takeaway from this talk to be, yes, you can go and fight giants. Almost all of us certainly probably couldn't, because we haven't trained in warfare. God's plan in this case was for David to become king. He was anointed. This would not fail. But he has to wait a really long time for this to happen. He's anointed when he's young. He takes the throne in his 30s. And we have hope in God's promise that we have eternal life. And actually, that is what we're holding on to, not the circumstances that we want to see in this world. God does tell us to ask him, to come to him and say what we want and what we need. And he does give good gifts. But we will also face situations where we need to turn to God. We will face situations where we need to rely on God. So my notes have collapsed, so bear with me 1 second. All right. Integrity may mean we need to face consequences. It may mean suffering. Patience is to be long suffering. And it might be that there's a situation where you need to act. It might be there's a situation where doing the right thing, having a heart for God, is not to. So we'll continue a little bit more with the narrative. Now, it comes to pass that Saul dies. Saul, abandoned by God, he gets told that he's going to be defeated. And he and his sons, including Jonathan, die in battle against the Philistines. And this mourns. This is great tragedy for David. This was the kingdom that we see under Saul. Before Saul, this is the kingdom that we see under Saul. You can see the Philistines have been attacking, and they've taken the lands of the Canaanites. What we see then from David is, as he becomes king, he then takes more land, and he has these great successes. He captures Jerusalem fully, and he makes it his capital. And you can see that this is then there's a civil war. It takes 7 years before he finally has the entirety of the kingdom, because one of Saul's sons lasts and lives up in the northern kingdom. But by the end of David's reign, he has taken over this huge area of land. All of the enemies around them have been defeated, and they're subdued, and they're paying homage to Israel. And so David was a strong king, and he fulfilled the promise that Saul was meant to. Then we see other situations where David brings the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem. God establishes a covenant with David, promising that his dynasty will endure forever. He continues to have military victories and expansions, and he secures all of the land that we've been talking about. And he also shows kindness to Jonathan's son, who's this disabled son, so therefore he's not going to become king, but he restores him to his family land. And he ends up tensions with the Ammonites and the Amorenes. He ends up fighting them as well, and he wins these victories. And so it's towards the end of David's life, when he's done all these great things, he's had this great success, that we see his greatest failure. And this is one of the most tragic and well-known stories of the Bible. You see, in 2 Samuel, David sins with this lady called Bathsheba. Now, this is in contrast to the earlier chapters where we see David goes out with the army. He stays home during battle. And as he stays home, he sees Bathsheba and he commits adultery with her. And he then tries to cover it up. He invites Uriah back. He says, go and sleep with your wife, because she's told him that she's fallen pregnant. But Uriah says, no, I'm not going to go and be home and have rest and celebrate when my men are out fighting. He shows up David for what he should have been doing. And he fails to manipulate Uriah, and so instead he sends Uriah back, and then he has him killed to try and cover up the fact that he is guilty. And so Nathan, who is the new prophet after Samuel, he comes and he confronts David. And he says, he gives him this story about a parable about a stolen lamb. And he says, this one person, he's rich, he has all of these sheep, and his neighbor only has one small lamb. And unfortunately, the rich man goes and steals this one lamb, and he kills it and eats it. And David hears this story, and he says, this is a terrible thing. That man should be put to death. And then Nathan turns around and says, that man is you. He tells him that is what he has done in the case of Uriah. And David's immediate response is to say, I have sinned against the Lord. He immediately realizes what he's done. And this is then what Nathan says. Nathan announces, yes, God will forgive David, but there are still consequences. The child that Bathsheba is pregnant with dies, and there is a plague that troubles David's house. David fasts and he prays to try and hopefully change God's mind and save the life of his son. But unfortunately, his son still dies. But it's interesting, after the death of his son, David worships God. Despite this terrible tragedy that is a response, is caused by what he's done, he ends up still showing submission to God. He turns back to God fully when he knows he's sinned. David fails. He has sex with his friend's wife, he commits adultery, and then he has that friend killed to cover it up. And it's very easy to look at him and think, well, I would never do that. What an awful man. It's better in this story to actually think of our own failures and actually identify with David and realize that we too are sinful. If you don't think you would ever do something like this, I'll put it to you, you've never been a Bronze Age king that has faced victory after victory after victory. He is an incredibly rich and powerful man at this point in his life. He's used to just taking things that he has. It's said that power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts. I put it to you that actually power just reveals the integrity that you already have. But the focus here, and this is the big difference between David, why he's considered a good king, and Saul, is David is immediately concerned that he's sinned against God, and he repents. He changes and he turns around. And he worships God. Samuel confronts Saul in 1 Samuel 14. Saul has disobeyed God's commands. He also gives this really strange vow not to eat that no one should eat any food immediately after the battle, so everyone's starving. And Samuel speaks to him, and he's concerned. He says, you've done wrong, you've disobeyed God. And then Samuel says, so I'm going to leave your presence. Saul isn't concerned with the fact he's disobeyed God. He wants Samuel to come back to him to give a show in front of the people that he's still right with God, even though he knows he isn't. He is far more concerned about what people think about him than what God thinks and God is saying to him. There will be times in your life that you fail. There will be. You can probably think of something recently. Here's the thing. Are you concerned about the opinions of people if people were to find out what you've done and what's happened? Or are you concerned about being right with God? If you're concerned about God, then it's confession and turning away from what you've done that is right. You know, in Psalm 14, David says this: they have all turned aside. Together they have become corrupt. There is none who does good, not even one. And in Luke, we hear this: for the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. You know, we know that we have done wrong. That is the entire reason Jesus came, to restore us into relationship with God. In Romans 10:10, it says this: for with the heart one believes and is justified, and with the mouth one confesses and is saved. We know that we've sinned. We know that we've done wrong. It's about seeking and coming to Jesus. Now, the very end of this narrative, it starts to not go so well for David. One of his sons, Amnon, rapes his daughter. His brother, the brother of Tamar, who's the half brother of Amnon, then kills Absalom, who's the one that raped. So Absalom kills Amnon. Absalom then rebels against David. There's this situation. He fails to act again. He ends up having to flee Jerusalem. There's a civil war again. Absalom ends up being killed. David returns to Jerusalem, and then he's faced with these people that have rebelled against him. But he shows them mercy. He shows mercy to his former enemies, and his life ends with him singing a song of praise to God. But then his life ends with another failure, and he orders a census to be taken to see how strong his people are, instead of just relying on God and trusting in God, because he's told not to do that. You know, we often think about heaven in a particular way. We think heaven is a place that's meant to be for good people. And actually, I think that's right. But then you ask, well, what is a good person? You quite often people, well, is it the balance of what's good versus what's bad? And if you've got more good than bad, then maybe that makes you a good person. But if the standard of heaven, which would be to be in God's presence, is goodness, then it would mean anything bad that you do would disqualify you from being in heaven. Because if you have any small thing is wrong, you can't be someone that is doing good in heaven. It's a place that can't tolerate sin, which is what we call wrongdoing. So all of us are disqualified. David is a man, through what he does, he would be disqualified. He's meant to be the best king. So ultimately, the lesson that we learn from David's life is this: despite him being a man whose heart was after God, he still was not enough that he could be saved through what he did. He too required a savior. And this is where Jesus comes in. This is what grace is. Not deserving it, but through faith we are saved, through the grace that we receive from Jesus. This is why Jesus had to come, to save us from our sin, that we would have eternal life with Jesus. And he came to restore that relationship. I encourage you, if you want to explore more of David's life, there's a lot of chapters to read, but it's some really interesting stuff. But you'll see the ultimate lesson of David is, no matter your successes or your failures, walking with God every day turning in your struggles to God is what he's asking for. And ultimately, we know that we have faith that Jesus loves us and he came to die for us, because none of us is ever going to live up to the standards of heaven.